episode 5 now, featuring our Latinist expert, Ryan Grant, who is the editor of the book De Controversiis on the Roman Pontiff, or the controversy of the Roman Pope, written by St. Robert Bellarmine. And this is a book was written back in the 1560s, that around the time of the Council of Trent. And the book was written as a compendium of the arguments that were made by Bellarmine and others against the protestations by the Protestants that the Holy Roman Pontiff, or the Pope, was an illegitimate character. There was no legitimate office, and he had no legitimacy, and there was no scriptural basis for it, and all manner of other criticisms. And so Bellarmine sought to undertake each and every one of these criticisms and answer each and every one of them authoritatively. That work has existed in the Latin since the 16th century, and it wasn't until recently that Ryan Grant took upon the task of translating volumes 1, 2, and 3. And we are in the middle of our discussion of volume 2 right now. And we have both of the, we have volume 1 and 2, and then volume 3 available also in the Founders Trading Post. If you're interested in the books, we have them. Just go to mikechurch.com, and you will find them in the, click on any of the Shop Mike store links, and you will find them in the Founders Trading Post. Very soon, we will have the Veritas Radio Network bookstore up and running, and you'll be able to find them there as well. So let's bring our Latin expert in, Ryan Grant. And Ryan, welcome to episode number 5 of Calvin Was Wrong. How are you?
Hello?
Yes, sir. How are you? Maybe I turned off. Hold on.
Uh-oh. We having connection problems? I might need to...
Hold on. No? Everything looks good to me on my end. You can't hear us?
I can hear you. Sometimes it goes in and out, and I'm not sure if that's my end or probably is my end. But...
Yeah, your connection is not very good. Why don't we drop, and we'll try and call you back.
Okay.
Let's do that. Well, it's still kind of squelchy, but I can hear you. I mean, it's we'll make do with what we have.
Okay.
So where we left off was in chapter 25. We were in book 2, chapter 5 in book 2. The first argument of our adversaries is answered, and that's where we left off the discussion in episode 4 in Bellarmine's book of volume 2. So where does that leave us then, as far as how far along we are in the argument for the existence of, the primacy of, and the legitimacy, the holy legitimacy of the office of the Pope?
Well, we're probably at that point about 40% through the entirety of the work between both volumes that I've published on it. And because after establishing that there is this ecclesiastical monarchy, and Christ did establish and confer it on Peter, now it's entirely on the successors of Peter. So as we mentioned, that the first step, the first half really of this book, of book 2 of that, which in our speak would be more like volume 2.
Volume 2.
But so he's now establishing that there are through history, and they're attested to by the church fathers and by Holy Scripture.
And now we have the first argument of our adversaries is answered. Now let us rebut the objections of Valenus, which also contain arguments from Calvin. And finally we get to Calvin and Illyricus. Now I look at the name Illyricus and I think Illyricus must be some kind of Latin rendition of not lyrical.
It is.
That sounds like a nickname, like you would call somebody Chuck or something like that.
Yeah. Illyria is in northwestern Greece, and in Dalmatia, that type of area, what we now today call the Balkans. Same area St. Jerome is from, actually. And Matthew Flavius was his name. He was a Lutheran. He was probably Luther's most energetic, even if terribly flawed disciple. And he's the one, whenever you see the Centuriators of Magdeburg noted here, he's the editor-in-chief of that entire work, and he Latinized his name to Illyricus. And a lot of these guys did that. They would get a Latin title on their name somehow, and just because that was the thing of the day. And they generally tended to enjoy that. And you see even Catholic writers like John Cocleus, I actually forget what his actual name was, but he Latinized his name to Cocleus. And you have the Lutheran Oecolampadius also. I can't remember his original name, but Oecolampadius is a Grecoization of his name. And so they a lot of them like to use nom de guerres at that time in history. So anyway, so now Calvin's in a very difficult position here because Calvin doesn't entirely reject that Peter went to Rome. And the problem for Calvin is he sees how well attested it is in the fathers. And he has a very hard time, denying it on that basis. So instead, he just goes to deny that it actually amounts to anything at all. Right? So the main person here that he's responding to is Valenus, as we mentioned last time. And most of Bellarmine's writing here comes from St. John Fisher. And it is St. John Fisher's book, the Convulsio Mondaciorum Voleni, etc. I can't remember the whole title in Latin. It's pretty lengthy. But, the convulsion of the lies and errors of Ulrich Valenus is what the work is by John Fisher. And so and Bellarmine makes explicit reference to this later in the book, toward, I think, about chapter 11. So now the first argument then is Valenus is saying that the authors don't agree on themselves in the time in which Peter came to Rome.
Okay.
And then the next point is that there's a great variety found amongst the authors of who succeeded Peter. That is, they numbered the popes differently. And so could it be that there's nobody at all? And so he adds, Valenus adds that all these make from Cletus and Anacletus one. Therefore, another can be established for certain discord, and the argument of the authors is a falsity. Right. So we see kind of the same tactics they use in modern historiography. Well, this one says this one says maybe it's really the same guy, and they got it all mixed up. So really, what it is nobody knows for certain because it was all false, and that's the argument. So first, Bellarmine responds to the question of the whole time. It's kind of interesting what he says because I think I mentioned this last time, when we think about BC and AD.
Okay.
Well, BC is, this is a construction of the Venerable Bede, right, the monk in the 6th century AD, to create this setup of, in Latin, ante Christum AC, and then in AD Anno Domini, not after death like most people think, in the year of the Lord. And so, and then it got rendered into anglicized as they kept Anno Domini, but then they rendered it in English before Christ, right, for a long time. So that was done by compiling the year of such and such emperor and the year of such and such emperor as to how many years after Christ. And that was a lot of careful work that Bede had to do. So doing history in this time was not a straightforward task like it is today, where we have timelines drawn up. We have the application of all these years of so many emperors to the system that Bede had set up. We have indexes and nice printed works. Bellarmine had to go scurrying through manuscripts to piece together things, writings of the fathers, things that were not in print. Just as in a lot of that's the work of Cardinal Baronius, getting all of these things categorized, set up, and then of course put into print. So so there was a lot of work that Bellarmine had to go through just to even accurately compile the history. And you have to compile it accurately because if you don't, well, somebody's going to catch it. So there's no fudge factors you can apply to this type of work.
Okay.
So although it's not the first time Bellarmine would do that, when he was in Louvain, he compiled a Hebrew grammar at a time when no such work existed beyond, say, Vitabulus's Lives of the Rabbis. And he made a boast that he would teach anyone enough grammar in a week to read the Hebrew Bible with nothing more than a dictionary. And he did. He was taken up on it, and they found that he was right. He did it. And he wrote a grammar that became the standard grammar in Hebrew for a couple hundred years, even for great scholars like Lapide and people like that. So he was very adept at getting deep into this historical detail. So just to preface his response then to the claim that all the authors disagree when Peter got there, maybe he never got there at all. So Bellarmine says about the time, even if that were true about when Peter came to Rome, it would not weaken our argument that Peter came to Rome at all. For it most often happens that one establishes something on a certain business and still does not establish on the manner or other circumstances. For it's certain among Christians that Christ died on the cross for us. Nevertheless, there's a very great disagreement on the time in which he died. Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, and Lactantius teach that he died in the 15th year of the Emperor Tiberius. that is in his actual 30th year, Christ's actual 30th year of life.
Okay.
Ignatius, Eusebius, and others say he was crucified in his 33rd year of age in the 18th year of Tiberius. Right, so he names on other people. So so basically, it shows that, well, if it was the case that all these writers disagree, and you couldn't find out the exact date on Peter, well, same thing is the case with Christ. It doesn't mean Christ didn't exist or was never crucified.
That's interesting. And let me ask you a question as we go through this process here, going through the book piece by piece. One of the things that we note here in the modern world is that popes today take their names from either prior popes or saints, as Pope Francis taking his name from St. Francis. Was there a tradition or maybe you could tell us a little bit about how this tradition began, that where today, for example, the next Pius would be Pius the 13th, right?
That's right, if there were one.
Yeah, right, and the next
actually,
Benedict would be Benedict.
There's an anti-pope, too. There's an anti-pope in Montana that claims to be Pius the 13th, actually.
Oh, okay. I was not aware of that. Well, you live near Montana. You're in Idaho, so maybe have you visited him?
No, I've not. It's actually, come to think of it, even though I'm fairly close to the border, I'm in North Idaho, but I don't think I've ever been into Montana except perhaps once. But apparently, tradition is so important to him, though. They have white smoke coming out of the chimney of his log cabin, 30 true believers or something like that.
So is there a place where the tradition begins, where you take the name and then you become the second, third, fourth, like Benedict would be Benedict the 17th, we'd have Leo the 14th coming up, and
right.
Of course the next Gregory, I believe, would be the 7th. Actually, I don't know what Gregory number we would be, but anyways, is there
17th, I believe.
17th? Is there a starting place for this?
Basically, when we look at the history of it, the original ones, they had their names, and they, so you see for Anacletus and then Cletus and then Clement, and then after Clement you start seeing various popes, and they have their names, and you don't see really repetition of names because it was actually their real names. And in those times, you wouldn't actually add the numbers for show another one by that name. So for Roman emperors in that time, anyway, in the 1st century, you were always named after your adopted family connecting you to Julius Caesar until Nero's time. So Caligula, for example, was Gaius Germanicus Caesar.
Okay.
And not the name Caligula, because in Latin Caliga it means boot, and Caligula means little boot. And when he was with his father Germanicus on the Rhine in the army, he used to wear his father's boots and try to command the guard around. And they thought this was hilarious, and so they gave him the nickname Caligula, and it stuck. Little boot. And,
little boot.
All throughout his reign, that stuck. Little boot, and of course it's all nice, cute when he's this little kid, but then he becomes this maniacal, evil character when he's grown up. But anyway, so that's one example. And likewise with Claudius, Gaius Germanicus, Claudius, Caesar, right? And so they, all these different emperors, that's basically their names. They don't get like these formal titles and things until later on, adding a numeral next to it. So as you get, some popes would take names after early martyrs, right, or after other saints, and sometimes they keep the right name. So it just kind of develops in the tradition organically, and then once they start, the chroniclers start noticing that there were so many popes by, like there would only be a handful of popes by such and such names. So at that time, of course, like say Pope Urban or Pope Damasus in the 4th century, Jerome would never have addressed them as Damasus the First because that was the only one.
He was the only one. He wouldn't need it. He wouldn't need to have.
The same thing. We don't say Pope Francis the First. We say Pope Francis.
Right. That's right.
So it's because he's the only one for that name. So that's just an example of that. So basically, that really comes from the chroniclers, and then eventually, as popes would then take names, it would be added on, and it was actually royalty in the Western tradition that copies that.
Oh.
So you have Charles the great, and then but every Charles afterwards, after Charlemagne, is then Charles II, Charles III, Charles IV, and then you get to Charles V, who was the emperor just before Bellarmine's time in the Holy Roman Emperor, and anything like that, so naming that, it actually follows the papal practice that the chroniclers had carried out.
So Bellarmine says that, and you're listening to the Modern Wrong World Made Right, Calvin Was Wrong, Episode 5, with our Latinist Ryan Grant, the editor of On the Controversy of the Roman Pontiff, which is a translation of a 16th century work written by Saint Robert Bellarmine. Bellarmine says that, no, we actually can give you a very clear date of when Peter went to Rome, and that is in the second year of Claudius. And he cites two authors, Eusebius and Orosius, as the principal authors who were writing history or some sort of history at the time, that say that they have notes or that they have reference that Peter came to Rome in the second year of Claudius, right?
That's right. And there's other sources too, and of course, he also does a comparison to the events and acts of the apostles to show, like, for example, when according to pagan historians, when Claudius, according to, I think it's Suetonius, who says that the Emperor Claudius booted all the Jews out of Rome because they were fighting with each other, according to this, the pagan historian writing, on account of a certain Crestus, right? He misspelled the names. He didn't know what it was about. But he had, so Bellarmine actually uses this date to show the time when Peter came back for the council and Acts of the Apostles, and then based on writings in Paul and certain other church fathers, when he went back to Rome, and then when Paul joined him there.
And then the next argument is, now we move in regard to the second part of the argument on the succession of the first four popes. To the first I respond, even if we were completely ignorant about who next succeeded Peter, still it would not be called into doubt whether someone had succeeded him. Just the same as the greatest question is treated among the writers, who was the husband of Esther? Since some think Xerxes the Mede, or the Meta, others Cambyses the Persian, others Darius Hystaspes, while still others Artaxerxes Longimanus, and still others that it was Menomon or Menomenon. Nevertheless, no one ever thought that there could be a doubt as to whether Esther had a husband or not. And I'll just interject right there, and we'll take our first break and come back and answer that question when we come back. That there was a made-for-TV movie about the Book of Esther, and I didn't even know that, so I went back and read the Book of Esther because I was curious after watching the movie, that the husband in that movie, Ryan, was portrayed as Xerxes. And many people that are listening to this broadcast or to the rebroadcast right now will think, is that any relation to Xerxes II from the movie 300? And I believe that is the same Xerxes, isn't it? Well, it's
no,
the same.
Not.
Or it's not. It's the same line.
It's a couple hundred years off, because the Persian Empire endured for a long time, including after about 150 years after. That was Xerxes the first of the Persian Empire, and this is supposedly Xerxes the second that is depicted in the Book of Esther.
Okay. So anyways, I thought we'll throw that out there, and the second question is coming up, that as to whether or not if you can accurately name in succession the successors, then Bellarmine's argument is going to be it doesn't matter because we can accurately say that there were successors, and we can pick the paper trail up in just a moment. Stand by. We'll come back with and continue with our Modern Wrong World Made Right. Calvin Was Wrong, episode number 5 with our Latinist Ryan Grant. Remember, the books that we are talking about, The Controversy on the Roman Pontiff, Volume 1 and 2, and we now have Volume 3, are available in my bookstore in the Founders Trading Post at mikechurch.com. They're very affordable in paperback, and you can pick a copy up today. We'll be right back here on the Crusade Channel, part of the Veritas Radio Network. Radio the way it should be. We're going to go back to our Latinist Ryan Grant and talk about our book here that's a subject of our discussion, St. Robert Bellarmine's book, which was translated by Ryan Grant into paperback form from the Latin into the English. This is a 16th century work on the controversy of the Roman Pontiff. And Ryan is back. He must be indoors. It must be near those that adorable brood of children of his. How many is that now? 5 or 6?
I have 5.
Five children. You know, you can always tell when you go to a traditional mass over a Novus Ordo in most instances, because the first 5 pews on either side will be filled by families with 7, 8, 9, 10 kids.
I know.
There were 5.
Well, somebody recently wrote an article about traditional Catholicism in the Pacific Northwest, specifically in North Idaho, and he wrote he tried to smear the FSSP, the Sedevacantist, and the SSPX like they're all pretty much the same thing. Mm-hmm. And he writes somewhere in Oregon for some Catholic paper there, and of course he doesn't know his own bishop comes out to give confirmations at the fraternity church in Coeur d'Alene that he's writing about as being a place of this nut job. So he writes a third of the parish is young, so it's not going anywhere. It's like a third of the parish. Have you ever been there? Easily 2/3 of it are young people with families. You know, you're working hard to find someone who's particularly old, you know, outside maybe the very early mass. It's kind of hard.
I've heard it said recently in the company of people that are attendees of the traditional Latin Mass here, which certainly St. Robert Bellarmine would have attended and would have given, and certainly the first popes that we're talking about, Pope Peter, in this instance, the first bishop of Rome and the first pope, would have begun the process of formulating the liturgy of, which is another study. Perhaps, you know, someday when we have time, if you research that after we finish this series, I would love to get into, because the liturgical part of the Tridentine Rite is just amazing to me. Who was it that said, was it Father Faber that said it's the most beautiful thing this side of heaven?
That's right, Father Faber is I forget. I think Tan publishes that work, but yes, he says that frequently.
But let's get back to our discussion about Robert Bellarmine and the work that we're talking about here, which is the controversy on the Roman Pontiff, and we're in book number 2, or volume 2, as we would call it. And Bellarmine is now answering specifically and directly the questions that are being posed by John Calvin and Illyricus and other Protestants about the actual existence of Peter. And where we left off, we were on the second part of the argument on the succession of the popes. Now, what is the controversy that he's having to address about the succession of the popes?
The Lutheran writer Philanus is arguing that the writers all disagree with each other about the list of popes and the time in which Peter got there. So therefore, we can surmise that it never happened. It's all just false. And so Bellarmine first argues that by a comparison to other things taken as certain with that have the same issue. So, he mentions that the years in which Christ lived, right? They say, well, there's a diversity of church fathers. Some say he died in his 30th year under Tiberius' 15th year of rule. Others say the 33rd, and that's his 18th year of rule. And so just on that basis, we'd have to deny Christ ever existed if we're going to deny Peter existed by this argument. But then he goes further, then, what is the succession? So he lays it out that between working through different fathers. Now, like you'll mention Eusebius a lot. Eusebius is a Greek writer. He wrote, he picked up where the writer Lactantius left off in terms of writing histories of things. So Eusebius wrote about the history of the early church. He'd read a lot of works in Greek and Latin, and he also wrote a life of Constantine that were basically works of their day. There's no good reason anyway to suppose that Eusebius lied or made this court thing, because he wasn't actually in Constantine's court. But on the other hand, it's modern historians kind of treat his works with suspicion on that he's always too given to whatever Constantine wanted, which is it's argumentation from assumptions that just don't. It just doesn't fly, because then, there were people alive that witnessed the events Eusebius wrote about. So if he's making stuff up, there would be well-informed criticism to meet this work as it's spreading around and being copied and sent around different places. Just a similar thing like they say with Caesar's Gallic War. They say, oh yeah, Caesar made it all up for the unlearned masses at Rome to support him. Well, that doesn't follow, because Cicero's brother, Quintus, was on Caesar's military staff. So Caesar's just making up all this stuff to make himself look good. Well, at home, because what does he want to do? He wants to run for consul again. He's going to have all this well-informed criticism, right? Right. So it's a similar type of thing with people had long memories in the Roman and Greek world, especially the learned classes that where Christians were more and more coming into. You would have had well-informed criticism if the guy's just making this stuff up. So, somebody would have written it down. It's not like the Da Vinci Code, where the church manages, the secret hidden Opus Dei network manages to burn all the documents and rewrite the history for you or something like that. So, except for obscure paintings somewhere or these types of nonsense. But so anyway, Bellarmine goes in then to looking at the chronologies of the popes. And so one of the things they notice, some of them say Clement has succeeded Peter, but some say Cletus. Linus succeeded Peter. I narrated it wrong earlier. Linus, then Cletus, then Clement. It's just as you see it in the Roman canon. So Bellarmine says, after the death of Peter, Clement refused to sit in the apostolic seat until Linus and Cletus, while they lived, who were aides to Peter himself in the episcopal office. For that reason, Clement was not the first pope from Peter, rather Linus was. As we so gather this from St. Epiphanes, who handed down from the opinion of the fathers that the seat was refused by Clement, while Linus and Cletus lived. Next, from this ambiguity, if Clement or Linus, or whoever else succeeded Peter without any contention, certainly there was no question would have existed about the first successor of Peter. Just the same on the first successor of James at Jerusalem and of Mark at Alexandria, and of Peter himself at Antioch, there was never any question. Okay. And then he adds, since the Roman Church, after the death of Peter, a holy contention was born from humility, and there was one and another that ought to be the first successor of Peter. From that obscurity, there was the succession was discovered. Also, so what he's saying there is that I'm reading from the Latin, actually. I should probably open up my actual translation of it. But
I was getting ready to say, the English version I have is not comporting with yours. It's close, so I figured he must be reading from the Latin.
Well, I mean, even if it's my own translation, I still prefer to go back.
It's pretty good. It's pretty close to what you translated, so continue.
Well, anyway, so he says these authors can be reconciled, whether place Clement ahead of Linus or Linus ahead of Clement. So accordingly, Irenaeus, Eusebius, Epiphanes, names of various fathers all the way through Augustine and Jerome. When they assert that Linus was next to have succeeded Peter, they assert what is true, but they do not deny that Clement had refused the episcopate. Next, Tertullian, Jerome, Rufinus, and the rest who write that Clement was left behind as successor to Peter, they also tell the matter truly, and they do not deny that Clement had in that time refused to receive the see. So what he's saying is that, all the fathers, where they seem to contradict, they're actually writing about the same thing, but from two opposite directions. So that, they are saying, yeah, Clement was supposed to succeed Peter, and then he waited out of humility, because then these two, Cletus and Linus, who were right next in the line, that they will, out of humility, he let them sit first, and then he sat as the next pope. It's one of those things I always ask the question that whether somebody could succeed, the pope could have succession in a hereditary fashion, or by naming a successor, like similar to hereditary fashion, by naming his successor before he dies. And actually, that was tried in the 7th century, and then the next pope didn't do that again. But Peter seems to have done that with Clement, and Clement seems to have refused on account of these two who had served Peter very closely, those Linus and Cletus.
Yeah, and there's I'm just reading through this, and I must have missed this page. This page is just chock full of details. It's not as though the St. Robert Bellarmine just went, we got all the facts on our side, you guys got nothing, and I'm just going to restate what's in the canon, and that's good enough. I mean, the research on this, Ryan, is just staggering, especially given, as you said, the time. Bellarmine would had to have gone to the Vatican or wherever they warehouse these records, and would had to have gone through box after box or cabinet after cabinet or scroll tube holder after scroll tube holder of actual manuscripts, probably written in Greek or in Latin, and to find the sources for the material that he was gathering here. It's just staggering. Moreover, after Linus, Cletus or Anacletus, after whom Clement must be placed forth, the authors are Irenaeus, Eusebius, Epiphanes, Jerome, and likewise the most ancient canon of the Mass, where we read of Linus, Cletus, and Clement, and thereupon Ignatius in his epistle, which means letter, to Maria Zarbensum, where he signifies Clement succeeded Anacletus after Clement, and ... just continues. I
Well,
mean,
it does.
what a
And the
body
Roman
of
canon's a great
research.
witness too, because the tradition holds that Peter himself wrote that, and because and that's the interesting thing too. You see in the Eastern liturgies, the liturgy of Saint Basil, you have the liturgy of Saint John Chrysostom. We know who authored those liturgies. We have various commentators in the Eastern tradition on how those were compiled. In the Roman liturgy, it's simply called the Roman liturgy. It's not given an author because in the habit in the apostolic period and immediately after was you didn't actually formally name the works that were done directly by the apostles. And so you don't have, so like in the Gospels, it's not, the name of the writer is not actually listed except in John by allusion. And the similar thing, that's how the church used to detect frauds in people who would claim this or that scripture, like the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas for that example, because nobody wrote a gospel and put their name on it. So, because out of humility, right, the apostles are emphasizing Christ, not themselves. So the similar thing with the formation of the Roman liturgy is that Peter doesn't put his name on it, he puts it in seminal form, but the Roman canon is held to go back straight to Peter. Now, of course, that's something modern liturgists, throw a nutty over, oh, no, wait, there's no proof of that, et cetera, except it's attested to with the tradition. So, I think it's a very good point. And then it is very ancient. There were minor changes in it from the 4th to the 6th century. And after I think about the 8th century until Pope John the 23rd added St. Joseph to the canon, the thing had not been touched in all of that time, from the 8th century until 1961.
Wow.
So it was so it's a tremendous monument to tradition. In all the earliest manuscripts of the liturgy and the Mass, you find this canon. Right? You find it written in this way. So it's a very powerful and impressive thing. Obviously, in the early stages, it was added to. Peter did not write the entire thing,
Right?
But you still find so it's the canon, of course, for the Church of Rome, and in there, excuse me, you name all the bishops. You name the bishops of Rome, starting from Peter on down, right, to a certain point where they stopped explicitly naming them because it establishes the font and the foundation of it.
Wow, that's just amazing. You're listening to The Modern Wrong World Made Right. This is Calvin Was Wrong, episode number 5, featuring our Latinist, Ryan Grant. You can always visit Ryan's website if you have any questions that you'd like to direct at him. That is Mediatrix, Mediatrix, press.com. And, of course, you can find Ryan Grant on Facebook. And I haven't seen you on the Twitter, but I assume you have a Twitter account.
I do, but I haven't the faintest idea how to use it.
Well, you're quite adept at the Facebook, or you can always just send me, or use actually we have the contact form now at VeritasRadioNetwork.com, where you can use the contact form and just choose Modern Wrong World Made Right, and it'll go right to Ryan and copy me. Okay.
There's also a contact form on MediatrixPress.com.
Well,
you just go to contact, there's a contact form there too, and that'll go to my email.
And if you're wondering what we're doing here in this episode of Calvin Was Wrong, it was John Calvin, among other Protestants, that claimed that during the Protestant revolt, that there was no historical precedence nor divine proof for the existence of the office of the Pope, that it had been made up and the whole thing had been fictionalized, and that therefore they didn't owe any allegiance to Rome, and they could go off and form their own churches and be their own bishops or their own popes or anti-popes or whatever it is that they wished to do. And so they proffered a series of arguments that the Holy Catholic Roman Church decided that it required an answer. We need to answer these guys, and we need to prove that they're wrong and they're in error and they're heretics. And so St. Robert Bellarmine was appointed for the job, and thus we read the works of St. Robert Bellarmine, translated from the Latin by our Latinist Ryan Grant. We are now in chapter 6, the second argument of our adversaries answered. And this is an interesting question. Now they question that Peter could not have come to Rome before 18 years after the Lord's Passion, for when the Council of Jerusalem happened in Acts chapter 15, Peter was still in Judea. But that council came to pass in the 18th year from the Lord's Passion, as St. Jerome gathers. How ironic that they would quote St. Jerome without acknowledging that St. Jerome was in the employ of the Catholic Catholic Church to go to Africa and gather the documents up that would ultimately make up the Bible that they would say would be the basis for sola scriptura.
What is an irony, actually, a lot of times they'll bring an argument from Jerome here and there, because Bellarmine will. There's a quote that that constantly appears in this work where Bellarmine uses it again and again and again in different books to show, like it's like in the one I'm working on right now on the church, and the different points where he'll talk about the authority of the Pope. And he brings Jerome's quote to the fore, where Jerome says, if because he's questioning whether you should say there's three hypostases in Christ. And that deals with a complicated Christological controversy. But anyways, there's a dispute of the terminology, and Jerome wasn't sure this certain terminology should be used. But in writing to Pope Damasus, he said, if you bid it to be so, then it will be so. Period.
Okay.
So this is, and this is the guy who compiled the Vulgate, who put together, who did the work, determining, the early text criticism and determining what scriptures to be used. Because there was another problem in the early church, which is that a lot of Jewish rabbis were opposed to, Christianity, and this comes from the early sources. And so one can take this, believe it or not, but in the early sources that the Jewish rabbis were corrupting the Septuagint and changing. So Origen puts together no less than 6 different manuscripts of the Septuagint that he's looking at, and he had to do criticism where things had been changed. And Origen came to the conclusion, again, rightly or wrongly, I'm not going to speculate, that the Jews had actually tried to change the Septuagint. And then the Masoretic text of the Hebrew, this is one of those interesting things when they say go back to the Hebrew. Well, your underlying Hebrew text, it doesn't have a manuscript that's any earlier than the year 1000. The Vulgate manuscripts are much earlier than that. You have a whole intact Vulgate in the 800s that's in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. I've seen it online. I haven't actually been there to see it. But you can look at the scans of it. I can read it just as well as prints. It's nice, neat, even handwriting and everything.
Wow.
There's Greek manuscripts, the 4th, 5th century. There's fragments from the 1st century. Right, and even stuff from the Septuagint we've seen in the Qumran findings, the Dead Sea Scrolls, so-called. So so a lot of the issues of text criticism are very alive and well. I'm not the most expert person on that subject to talk to, but Jerome was engaging that problem in his day. Right, and it produced a Bible. And so one problem in text criticism, obviously, is copyist errors and things like that.
Sure.
Discrepancies of the Greek and the Latin, and that's always a big problem. So, but Jerome is one of the guys doing this work.
Interesting. Okay, so how was the question answered about the 18 years and whether or not Peter was in Rome or he could have been in Rome?
He says if before 18 years Peter could have come to Rome, certainly he would have come in the 2nd year of Claudius, as Bellarmine says, as we said above. And that cannot be, both because in that year St. Peter was not yet freed from the prison in which Herod had thrown him. That liberation happened in the 3rd year of Claudius, which we gather from Luke and also from the writer Josephus. And Christ had also commanded his apostles that they should not leave from Jerusalem before 12 years. But as Eusebius relates from Thrasea the martyr, this fell in the 12th year from the resurrection of Christ, in the 3rd year of Claudius. Therefore, Peter did not come to Rome in the 2nd year of Claudius, but after the 9th year. And that's important for the dating later, which was the 18th year from the Lord's Passion. Moreover, Peter is said to have sat at Rome for 25 years by Damasus, Eusebius, Jerome, and others. Therefore, he lived even to the 43rd year after the Passion of our Lord. But then he would not have died under Nero, nor even Galba, Otho and Vitellius, but while Vespasian reigned. Therefore, Peter... sorry, this is not Bellarmine. This is the argument that's against it.
Okay.
And so Vespasian was a very, meek emperor, and he did not kill any Christians, and Rome is all witness. So thus, on that basis, Valenus says, therefore, he didn't go to Rome. So then Bellarmine responds, although the fathers could have erred when they said the Apostle Peter sat at Rome for 25 years, nevertheless, on that account, it would not follow that Peter was never at Rome, as we showed above by bringing many similar arguments. But there is no need to appeal to those arguments, since Peter truly sat at Rome for 25 years, and 7 at Antioch, and all things still be consistent. This is then the true and brief history of St. Peter, and actually a lot of this he's taking from Cardinal Baronius' work, because I had noticed a similar thing in Baronius' work, the Annales. St. Peter remained in Judea for nearly 5 years, for which reason St. Paul could easily meet Peter in Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion, and rightly, Eusebius places the journey of Peter to Antioch 5 years after the Lord's Passion. This is also not opposed to that tradition of Thrasea the martyr. Indeed, the Lord did not command that all the apostles should remain in Jerusalem for 12 years. It is certain that this is false from the Acts of the Apostles, where we read that Peter set out into Samaria, Lydda, Joppa, and Caesarea before he was cast into prison, and also to the point that, before the 12th year of the Passion of Christ. On the other hand, or rather, Christ commanded that not all should leave, that always some, or even some from the apostles, would remain in Jerusalem, according to the testimony of the Hebrews. Therefore, in the 5th year, after the Lord's Passion, Peter set out into Syria. He set up a see at Antioch and remained nearly 7 years as a bishop of that city. He says it's not probable. It's not probable what Onofrius teaches in the additions to Platina, that St. Peter did not sit at Antioch unless it was after he returned from Rome. Accordingly, he could produce no father as an author, and no church father as an author in his behalf. Rather, what we teach is what they taught before us. Right. So he's showing the link that all this narration, we're not just making up. This all comes from the fathers and tradition. Okay. And so some of this is footnoted. Footnotes are very complicated in this work because, like in all Renaissance disputations, you just give your notes after what you say. It's not parenthetical. There's no system of footnoting. So as I go through, generally when I translate, I have to eventually make decisions about the footnoting as I'm going, and then go back and revise those. And frankly, a lot of those still could be revised too, because a lot of them, they just don't fit into a modern standard. So I'm trying to standardize them and get them worked out correctly has been a bit difficult. But in any event, Bellarmine continues, still, this must not be so received as if he never went out from Antioch in that whole time, nay more, that he traveled in the same time to nearby provinces such as Pontus, Asia, Galatia, Cappadocia, and Bithynia. And all those are in modern Turkey, by the way.
Okay.
So from there, even he set out in the 7th year of the Antiochian episcopate, which was the 11th after the Lord's Passion. He returned to Jerusalem and there was taken by King Herod and thrown into prison on the days of unleavened bread. Right, and that's related in Acts 12. But a little after, he was freed by an angel in the same year, which was the 2nd of Claudius, and at the same time he came to Rome. He set up his see there and held it for 25 years. Still, in that whole time in which he was Bishop of Rome, he did not remain at Rome. Rather, after that, he preached at Rome for 7 years, returned to Jerusalem after the expulsion of Claudius, when he expelled the Jews from the city. Luke writes that Claudius had expelled all the Jews from the city, and Suetonius writes the same thing about Claudius. Likewise, Josephus, as Orosius cites, and Orosius himself adds that this was done in the 9th year of Claudius. That is in the 18th year from the Lord's Passion. So you remember I mentioned in the first segment that the Roman historian Suetonius writes that the Emperor Claudius had to boot all the Jews out of Rome because this dispute, basically because Christianity is setting in and they weren't happy about it. So therefore, they heard, who were at Antioch, that Peter came into Jerusalem. They sent to him Paul and Barnabas, and then the Council of Jerusalem took place. After Claudius died, however, Peter returned to Rome and ended his life in the same place. So then he adds on, now the fact that Peter was at Jerusalem a little before the death of Herod doesn't contradict this, since it's certain that Herod died in the 3rd year of Claudius. For St. Luke does not say Peter was in bonds a little before the death of Herod, but he rather more indicates the contrary, when he says that after the liberation of Peter from prison, Herod set out for Caesarea, and there was delayed. This delay, no matter what extent of time it means, that at least it was a year. St. Luke relates after the death of James and the imprisonment of Peter, these come immediately after the death of Herod, so as to show the horrible ruin of Herod was a penalty for the sin he committed against the apostles of the Lord.
So, we're going to have to take a break, our final one of this episode. This is the pestilence of the worms. Is that what happened to Herod?
Yes, that's
something
right.
like that, right? Some horrible.
Well, actually, not quite. It's a similar thing. He dies from a different disease. You're thinking of Herod the Great. He's the one that the worms eat out his innards.
Right.
He dies from this very nasty thing that I can't describe on air.
No,
but,
it's it's awful. I tell you what, hold that thought. We'll come back and we'll wrap today's episode of The Modern Wrong World Made Right up. Remember, all the books that we're discussing here, St. Robert Bellarmine's on the Roman Pontiff, the controversy on the Roman Pontiff, Volume 1 and 2, and Volume 3, available in the Founders Trading Post at mikechurch.com and at Ryan's site at mediatrixpress.com. We'll be right back with our final segment of this day. This is The Modern Wrong World Made Right. Calvin Was Wrong, episode number 5, with our Latinist Ryan Grant. This is the Veritas Radio Network, radio the way it should be. All right, Ryan, 2 minutes to set up, I guess, next week's segment. And Chapter 7 is another 5 arguments are answered. And it won't be long that we'll be done with Volume 2, and then we can proceed into Volume 3. But I think what we learned today here in this episode of Modern Wrong World Made Right, that Calvin was wrong, was that Robert Bellarmine is not to be regarded as a lightweight when it comes to history.
No, he's not. And actually, Pope Benedict XVI had mentioned the same thing on St. Robert Bellarmine's feast day on the New Rite calendar a few years back. I'm thinking about 2011. He said some remarks about how his particular genius was to utilize history and theology. Nothing had been so neglected in the history of the church. And so the crisis that comes out when the Centuriators of Magdeburg write their book, because even though it was shoddy history, it was actually a Calvinist writer and said that as a history it was absolutely worthless. But at the time, it was the only work of its kind. And so this was eaten up, and people followed it. And it was so that's why it required refutation, which the church was able to do. But it did heighten the fact that history had been overlooked, because it's a hard job. Right? It's a hard job to get into this stuff and go through all these manuscripts and actually write a narrative history that could be followed, that could be sourced, that could be traced back, that was accurate. So,
yeah, it's quite a job, and I'll tell you that the brother Andre Marie told me St. Robert Bellarmine joke, and that is, Bellarmine had quite a large nose, and
yes,
in all his paintings, his pictures having a large nose, and that he would walk around the monastery, and the brothers would always ask him why he'd always have a fly or something run around his nose. Father, why don't you swat the fly? Why don't you get rid of him? And Bellarmine would say something to the effect that he didn't want to disturb the peace of the fly.
Right.
He was perfectly content that if the fly needed a place to hang out, that if he wanted to use his nose, that he would treat it as a mortification of sorts, and he was cool. Well, we got about 30 seconds left, and that'll wrap our episode up here. We'll pick up where we left off next week, or as soon as we can reconvene this with Ryan Grant. Ryan, thank you for your time, as always.
Thank you.
Yeah, hang on a second. I want to talk to you after we're finished. Folks, download all 4 previous episodes of Calvin Was Wrong at VeritasRadioNetwork.com. We'll see you next week.